Good afternoon. I'm learning how to shout. So welcome back. It's great that you are here again. A beautiful day, but really interesting conversation indoors. I will just kick off this session very briefly. We will be talking about the role of philanthropy. Price, who was formerly a CEO at the Urban League, president and CEO of the Urban League, and is now here as a distinguished practitioner, will moderate the discussion and introduce the panelists. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. Everybody can hear, we're all wired up. Let me start with a point of personal privilege just to say what a treat it is to be teaching here at the Woodrow Wilson School. Friends occasionally ask why I haven't simply retired, and I tell them that clinical trials show that prolonged exposure to Princeton students helps to ward off Alzheimer's. And it's working quite well. And as you can hear from the questions asked, you understand why, and you all are alumni, so you understand even better. We have a very interesting panel today that focuses on the role of philanthropy in international development. I did spend 6 years as vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation, but I wasn't involved in the international side, so I'm flying a little blind today as moderator, but that's okay. It ensures my neutrality. We have three quite remarkable alumni of the Woodrow Wilson School who've had extraordinary careers and who, interestingly enough, given the topic, have lived on both sides of the tin cup. They've held the cup and they've tried to reach in and grab some money out of the cup. So we have wonderful perspectives. Peter Bell served for 10 years as president of CARE, which, as we know, is one of the world's leading private relief and development organizations. Prior to that, he was president of the Edmund McConnell Clark Foundation for 9 years, where the focus is on helping people who are poor and disadvantaged, primarily in the United States. And he also served as president of the Inter-American Foundation, which, as I heard him say during the break, is the only job he'd ever been fired from, but I'm sure it was a growth experience. Secondly, Deborah Derrick, who is the Senior Program Officer in Global Health Policy and Advocacy for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She previously served as Executive Director of the Better World Campaign, which is an advocacy organization that works on behalf of the United Nations. She's the author of a book called The Very Thing That Made Us, and she is a former television producer with C-SPAN. Thirdly, we have Dennis Whittle, who is the co-founder and CEO of GlobalGiving, which has been described as an eBay for aid and philanthropy. They have facilitated millions of dollars in funding to over 800 projects around the world. Prior to founding GlobalGiving, Dennis worked with the World Bank for 14 years, and he co-led the bank's corporate and innovation units, which, among other things, created the development marketplace, an open access competition for funding that has been replicated in over 50 countries. I've asked each of them to speak for 10 minutes, and in the order of those introductions. After that, I will pop one question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So let us start with you.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here back at the school again, and a pleasure to serve on this panel. I shouldn't keep you in suspense about why I was fired from the Inter-American Foundation, although I sort of told the tale here some years ago. The Inter-American Foundation is a public corporation, not the category that is being considered here in this panel. But it was created by Congress as a kind of experiment in foreign aid to be removed from short-term partisan politics and short-term foreign policy considerations, and to reach people at the grassroots in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it did so well that at the beginning of the Reagan administration, there was a real movement afoot to sort of take over this organization and have it work for other purposes during the period of the Cold War and the military dictatorships in Latin America. And I was its president and accused of not having been sufficiently pro-American in terms of the relationships with the grantees and partners of the foundation in Latin America. there was a report commissioned that was to investigate my conduct of the foundation. And the very last words of the report, conducted by a former covert operations person for the CIA who was hired by the Heritage Foundation, was that it is well and good to involve poor people in their own development, but wrong to let them be in charge. I won't tell you about the other times I was fired. Let me just start but just say a word that I suspect a feeling that may have been shared by some others of you here in this room today, and that is that I did not agree with the tone and conclusions of the first panel that started us off today on aid effectiveness. And I think, among other things, it showed the limitations of trying to sort of count things, particularly in sort of in relatively short term, and also we never taught. And this is relevant, I think, to our panel here too. The panelists really did not talk specifically about what they meant by development or what they meant by poverty. And to me, poverty is about is not about low per capita income, although that is part of being impoverished. It is about, I'm afraid, for lack of a better word, about disempowerment by many measures. And that's one of the things that makes it difficult to measure development, because there are so many measures of it. And to me, development has to do about increases in the measure of influence and control that people may be able to exercise over decisions that importantly affect their lives. And whether it be at the individual level, the family level, the community level, or the national level. And if I sort of think about where I would like to see U.S. policy go, I mean, ideally, for the long term, it would be to place the reduction and indeed the ending of poverty, and particularly extreme poverty, as a strategic goal of the United States in its own right, not as subsidiary to other strategic, political, and military objectives. And I think it's important to say that, not because I don't respect the pragmatism within which people engaged in USAID, in the civilian side of the US government, feel that they must exercise in today's world. But it's important to have a vision as to where we would like to see the United States eventually move. And I think it's relevant as well to this panel, an extent to the degree when we talk about philanthropy, which you may say this is idealistic, where it's not realistic. We're in let's face up to the real world. The United States is at war, as President Bush told us, and you're either with us or you're against us. But the context in which we're talking, again, to look at the long term, is one in which we have been, well, with some ups and downs, but over many decades now, building our reliance in this country increasingly on our military security capacity. And when you have it, it's difficult not to use it. It becomes the first option all too often, and particularly when you have been disinvesting, in effect, on the diplomacy and on the development side. And I think this is the situation in which we find ourselves. And very often it's people within the Defense Department itself, within the military, who are among the first to agree. And I'll say this with profound respect over and over again for the professionalism of our military in this country. But turning to philanthropy, what philanthropy is about basically is it is love of humankind. It just is that simple. And what development is all about at its core is respecting, protecting, and advancing human dignity. I mean, to me, the advancement of human rights are at the very core of what development is about. It is, and I think it's a real advantage of philanthropic organizations that they can unabashedly make this their own sort of guiding priority. And particularly, there are two sets of organizations that I think are particularly germane here, in part because of their size, of their increased influence over recent years. And those are our foundations, private philanthropic foundations, and international non-governmental organizations, humanitarian and development organizations. And of particular interest are those largest organizations in these fields, starting on the foundation side with the Gates Foundation, but also such organizations as the Ford Foundation, Hewlett, Soros, and Rockefeller, and others. And on the NGO side, the largest, not quite comparable to Gates in terms of the difference in magnitude, is World Vision, but then CARE, Save the Children, Catholic Relief Services, and others. And in both cases, the dozen or so largest these organizations occupy a highly disproportionate share of the resources of the organizations as well.
Let me ask you if you would to hold your thoughts at that juncture, and let me pass it to Deborah.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be back here at Princeton. I haven't come for one of these reunions to date, so this has just been a terrific experience, and thanks for hosting. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Gates Foundation itself and not try to get into development, which is really not my field. My background is in U.S. government relations, and that's what I was brought into the Gates Foundation to work on, U.S. government relations vis-a-vis global health. And Raj Shah, who preceded me, talked about the mission of the Gates Foundation, so I'm just going to echo the same words that he put forward, because the overriding mission for those of us there and the work that we do is to work on the premise that all lives are created equal, and that how long a person lives, whether you die before your fifth birthday or not, or whether or not you're able to get an education, should not be determined by your postal code or the lottery of where you were born. We make grants in 3 areas, global health and global development, and education or U.S. programs, which is a slightly broader basket of work. In global health, we work a little bit on a stovepiped basis. We tend to approach the work that we do with particular metrics in mind in things like HIV/AIDS or malaria, TB, family planning, and so on. So we've got a span of different kinds of health problems, issues, or conditions that we're trying to address. And in global development, we tend to work on things that affect small farmers, which is often women, and providing financial services for the poor, again with a big emphasis on women. In U.S. programs, we work on education and college readiness, also for disadvantaged populations. And that section of the foundation is within the United States. The other 2 are, of course, global. All of these programs are approached with Bill Gates' orientation, as you can imagine. Coming out of Microsoft, he tends to take a little bit of a technological approach to his work and to the foundation's work. So if you're looking at global health, many of the endeavors that we work on have to do with drugs and diagnostics and technologies, and he's looking to invest in and create things that are going to leapfrog humanity forward and get over some of the problems that humans face. One of the examples that's often trotted out by the head of our global health division, Tachi Yamada, is he talks about polio and polio eradication and our quest for polio eradication. And he said that back in the 1940s, when people were trying to figure out what to do about polio, there were some in the medical field who wanted to build more iron lungs and build more hospitals. And happily, some other people decided to invest in vaccines, which obviated the need for those iron lungs and hospitals. So that's the kind of orientation that Bill tends to bring towards the things that he's trying to address through the foundation. We're also very, very tightly focused, and I think this stems from his business orientation, tightly focused on metrics and measurement and trying to get value for the dollar. I'll get more into that in a little bit. I joined the foundation in 2008, a couple of years after Warren Buffett made his tremendously generous donation to the foundation. And for any of those, for those of you who know about private foundations, one of the IRS criteria for private foundations is that you spend a certain amount of your endowment on an annual basis. So all this money had been flowing in, and the foundation was then on this tremendously fast-paced growth for both the grants that it was making and the number of people it was bringing on board. I think they doubled in size in the last year and a half before I joined, and it was really like the Wild West. And in fact, my first business meeting at the foundation was unique for my career, and I've worked in a lot of different places. It was unique in that we had this business meeting and they pulled us all in and they sat us down in a room and they said, well, it's almost September 30th and we need to make sure that we're going to make our payout, and I just want you to go out and spend. I mean, how many organizations? I mean, it wasn't quite that way, but the objective was to try to get to our payout. And then the economy crashed, and our growth has not continued on that same trajectory, but it is still growing. And at the moment, we have an endowment that's $37 billion, or that was at the end of 2010. We have about 900 people on staff, so it's a pretty substantial foundation. Most of them are based in Seattle. About a tenth of the foundation is based in Washington, D.C., which is where I am, and we're slated to continue growing for the next year. To give you some sense, we're anticipating going up from about 900 people to 1,000. The grants that we make in global health and global development and U.S. programs are split roughly 50% of all the money that we put out on an annual basis is in global health, another quarter each in global development and U.S. programs, and the sense of magnitude, $1.5 billion last year in global health, $500 million in global development, $400 million in U.S. programs. Those are estimates, of course. Some of the overriding principles that Bill, again, with his business orientation, has brought to the foundation are to be fairly tightly focused on a specific set of objectives. So when he was making decisions in global health, for example, on what he was going to invest in, he realized that even with a lot of money, you couldn't take care of everything in the world. So he narrowed the focus down deliberately to infectious diseases. And he, for example, made a determination that in business, people would invest, or other organizations might be investing in things like emergency problems or natural disasters and so on. But in global health, what we were going to invest in was things that others were not going to pick up. And so he narrowed it down and brought that business orientation to the foundation. And we get questions a lot of time about why we're not funding mental health or why we're not funding heart disease, and that's just because he feels like those things may be picked up by other institutions or businesses around the world. He also has a mantra that we take risks and we do pull out if things are not going well. And anyone who's a grantee out there who's lost a grant from us, I apologize, because we do sometimes stop grants if they're not doing very well. And then finally, and I think this is probably one of the biggest parts of our work, is we choose not to do the work ourselves. What we do is we do work, we put money into others and then try to leverage what they do, or leverage what we find and get other people to buy into the objectives of the foundation. When I first joined the foundation, there was a Lancet article that came out where people were, the author of the article was complaining that the grants-making process at the Gates Foundation was completely non-transparent, and he was calling for an explanation of how the grants got made. And after having been there for about a half a year, I turned to a colleague and I said, if he can find out, I wish he'd let me know. Because it's a big, sprawling organization with a lot of people set up to do a lot of different grants, some of which are deliberately competing with each other. And the whole idea is to move the ball forward, and I think taking a bit of an engineering approach to these problems so that you get a lot of different activities in line and see which ones come out at the front. When I give you an example, in our maternal and neonatal and child health programs, what we do is try to determine what are the biggest problems, what are the 4 largest problems causing maternal mortality, what are the 4 largest problems that's killing newborn babies, and then direct grants across particular geographies that can address those and prove the concept that introducing misoprostol or putting a salve on the umbilical cord is going to prevent a disease. And then once we've proved that, then we take it to people or other organizations like WHO or the United States government and try to encourage them to actually fund the work and bring it to scale. So again, we don't think that we can take care of the world's problems, but what we do is try to prove the concept in a variety of different places and instances so that others can learn and then move forward from there. We do also take a very, as I said, a metric orientation, or have a lot of metrics in the work that we're doing. And I've never seen so many McKinsey reports as I've seen at the Gates Foundation. It's a very introspective, reflective organization. We have our evaluators evaluating our evaluations. I think I'll probably stop at that, okay, and then let
Dennis?
So late one afternoon in March in Helsinki in 2009, a young software developer named Jaakko Isala went into his boss's office. His boss was a guy named Nicholas Head. He was the co-founder of a company called Rovio. And he showed him a prototype of a software game that he had developed. And Nicholas, the co-founder, just kind of put his head down on his desk and sighed and decided not to say anything. This young software developer had submitted hundreds of ideas to him over the past 3 years. and most of them were just absolutely terrible. And he had meant to fire him several times, but he had never gotten around to it. This seemed like the last straw. But he really needed to go. It was late in the afternoon, and his mother was waiting for him. His mother was cooking dinner for him that night. And so he left. He didn't say anything. He just took the papers and left. And he went to his mother's house in the suburbs of Helsinki, and he went into the door, and his mom said, you know, welcome, Nicholas, and he was kind of run down, and she said, you know, what's wrong, honey? What's wrong? And she said, and he said, Mom, my company's about to go bankrupt. We've launched 51 games for the iPhone, and we're running out. None of them have been successful, and we're running out of money, and we're on our last legs. And she said, that's, you know, I'm sorry. And he said, and you know what makes it worse is I just get this crap from my designers. And he puts this thing down on the table, and she said, well, what is this? And he said, this is a game that this guy, Jaakko, came up with today. And it involves these fat red birds being slingshotted at pigs in houses. And he said, I just can't take it anymore. And she said, she looked at it, and there was a pause, and she said, oh, this is kind of cute, actually. And he said, Mom, oh, God, I don't know why I even told my mom about this. Mom, what do you know about iPhone apps, anyway? And she said, well, I don't even have a smartphone, but I think this is kind of cute. So Nicholas Head went back the next day, and to please his mother, who he had neglected since he started this company, he decided to let the development of this game go forward. That game, as many of you can probably guess, is Angry Birds. It is the single biggest selling iPhone application in history. Probably somewhere on the order of 90 million people use this thing, and they waste or use up to maybe 300 million hours a day on this game of fat red birds being slingshotted at pigs. And just last month, Rovio, this company, got $42 million of venture capital to scale up and do more games like this. Now, I like this story because it kind of illustrates how our economy works. And it illustrates the open access nature of the economy. This Jaakko character at this small firm in Helsinki was able to throw ideas out there. Open access, anybody can come up with an iPhone game. It demonstrates how much experimentation is done out there. This firm launched 51 previous failures before it hit the big time, the Angry Birds. And it demonstrates the incredibly rapid feedback that you get from the marketplace. This guy was going bankrupt because his games were not selling. And every time they launched a game, they could tell immediately on the App Store, on Apple and in the Android store, whether people wanted this game or not. It involves a lot of personal risk. This guy was sweating it out at his mom's house because he was personally about to go bankrupt at this company. But he succeeded. And it illustrates how capital flows to ideas that address things that people want. He got $42 million. And he also did this on top of this iPhone. And many of us have iPhones or Androids or whatever. And most of us believe that Apple has just been incredibly successful since day one. Most people believe this. Apple almost went bankrupt in 1999. And Apple almost went bankrupt because they had a lot of terrible products that they developed and launched. And Steve Jobs got forced out. Apple has faced huge market pressure, feedback, constant feedback from the marketplace. 2008, Apple announced that they were going to create a phone. And everybody laughed at Apple. Ericsson, Motorola, Nokia. They said, Apple doesn't know how to make a phone. Apple's never made a phone. We know how to make phones. Apple should stick to computers, and we'll make the phones. Apple launched the iPhone. The biggest success, probably the biggest success ever in electronic history was the launch of the iPhone. But Apple had been through its ups and downs as well. So I thought about these dynamics of the market system. And I started thinking, how many of them apply to the aid or even the philanthropy system? And in all my years at the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, et cetera, how many Yako Isons did we had a chance to come and pitch an idea for an Angry Birds for aid? How much experimentation did we really do with our 5-year projects? How much market feedback did we get? Really? We had feedback from our evaluators who happened to be us. How much personal risk did we face? The things we did. And how easy was it to get additional capital to scale things up? And I think the answers to those things are pretty self-evident. And so when we were talking about the panel of what philanthropy can do for development or aid or whatever, however you want to think about it, I started thinking about the possibilities for philanthropy to address some of these problems of access, of feedback, of experimentation, of reward and risk, and of scaling up. And based on the conversations we had this morning with Angus, Deaton, and Raj, and then our panel, I thought maybe there's 3 areas that I think there's some hope where philanthropy can make a catalytic difference to the system of aid. The first of these is just providing opportunity. And we've heard a lot about opportunity. In some ways, aid is nothing more than just helping people help themselves. And the biggest successes of aid have really been when we've done this well. And Professor Deaton this morning talked about the examples of health, the germ theory of illness. And probably the most dramatic advances in human welfare have come through very simple new health innovations. Education is another area that I think is neglected. Someone talked today about President Kennedy's opening up the United States for a lot of Indians to come to the United States and study, and dated that back to a lot of the Indian reforms. I spent 5 years in Indonesia, where pretty much the whole technocratic government structure there had been educated by the Ford Foundation in the 50s and 60s. And they laid the basis for the prosperity and the democracy in the country that you see today that's so little talked about. So that first one's opportunity, education, health, other interventions that help people help themselves. The second is democratization of voice. And the interesting thing about the cell phone and other technologies is not just that they're cool and small, etc., but that they really give us the possibility to democratize, I think, the aid process, whether it be through philanthropy or through official aid. If you think about the structure of the industry, a bunch of us went to Woodrow Wilson and were hired so that we'd be the smartest people to go to Gates or World Bank or wherever to study the problems in the world, decide what people wanted, develop solutions for them, and then deliver it to them. And then, by the way, we evaluated it as well. New technology and just new advances in the world mean that we can begin to directly ask people, hey, what do you want? What matters in your life? And then how about if we give that to them? How about if we put them in charge? The same thing that got Peter fired however many years ago. Maybe technologically possible. Hopefully it won't get me fired now. But what if we did put them in charge of what they want? And then what if we asked them how it's going? Instead of hiring all these experts to go out and evaluate things, what if we just ask people, that project, how's it going? Do you like it or not? Democratization of voice. Really fundamental possibilities are being opened up for us here. Those things also force much more rapid feedback loops, learning and adaptation, speed up innovation, speed up things that actually work. And finally, these are all related to, again, going back to what Angus talked about this morning, I think is good governance. And governance in some ways is a function of good information and skills, good relationships. I mean, democracy in some ways is about social capital and relationships. And then also about values. You have to have good values, I think, to have good governance. And I believe that a lot of these things, a lot of these factors can be enhanced and stimulated by innovative philanthropic interventions. In this afternoon's concluding section, we're going to hear from Anne-Marie Slaughter about global public policy networks. Global public policy networks are at their root about relationships, about building relationships between people, exchanging knowledge, exchanging expertise, and really building a shared value system. And philanthropy, I believe, can play a tremendous role in fertilizing the ground and helping make that possible. So that's...
Okay, thank you. I want to pose a question and ask any or all of the panelists to respond, and while we're going through that, I invite you to think about any questions you may want to ask and begin to come down front, because we'll open it up very, very shortly. First, it's interesting. We've got Deb from a massive foundation. I think that's a fair characterization. Peter ran a medium-sized foundation, and Dennis is operating at what we call the micro-philanthropic level. When you think about the array of possibilities that foundations consider when they're engaged in development, just to mention a couple, we've talked about health, education, hunger, poverty, leadership development, and what might be called democratization or civil society. I'm curious whether any of the three of you have both examples of where philanthropy has gotten it right in the international sphere in any of those areas, and examples of any cautionary tales where they've stubbed their toes or have had to learn on the job the hard way.
I'd like to talk about polio, which has emerged as one of Bill Gates' top priorities. For those of you who may not know, the world has made some tremendous progress in polio in the last couple of decades. There's been a 99% reduction in the number of cases globally. We're down to a handful of countries that still have polio inside of them, and only 4 endemic countries, 4 countries where they've never stopped transmission. Those countries, interestingly enough, happen to be Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and India. And Nigeria and India is just sections of the countries. But the reason I bring polio up is because there have been times when philanthropists and the world generally have taken their foot off the gas pedal. And with something like polio, if you take your foot off, then you have a whole new group of babies being born that don't get immunized, and you can have a resurgence. So even if you're 99% of the way there today, if you take your foot off of the accelerator now, you could very rapidly end up with another 200,000 children coming down with polio and having a resurgence in places, where it had been stopped before. So that's one of the cautionary tales that I would make.
Okay, good. Any triumphs, any examples where philanthropy you feel has really gotten it right?
Well, that's a nice example. Yeah, I mean, it's true of immunizations generally, as you're pointing out. I think one of the advantages of foundations should be a willingness to take risks. And then you ask, what does you mean by risk? I mean, one measure of risk is controversy. And there's often a cautionary part of this can be that often the boards of foundations are very eager to maintain their foundation's respectability. One of the advantages that a foundation may have is when the Soros Foundation or a Gates Foundation is when the initial donor is still there. And if, in this case, if he is willing to take that risk, he can pretty well commit the foundation to doing it. I think that some of the most important things that I was involved in my foundation work, going back to the early part of my career, were in Chile, when I was there throughout the Allende period. Socialist government committed publicly to making a legal democratic transition toward socialism. And when And we decided to take it seriously as a foundation, a Ford Foundation. When eventually the country became increasingly polarized and the military junta overthrew the regime, the government, the elected government of AND, we faced a decision within the foundation. There was a group of people who wanted to make the Ford Foundation into an anti-inflation fighting organization because they believed that the inflation caused social instability. And there were others of us who were advocating for making it into a human rights organization. And ultimately, the president of the foundation decided on the latter course, which we in Chile had recommended. And it had a profound effect within Chile, eventually, and also had an effect in terms of being, I think, one of the real sort of impetuses to what became the Ford Foundation's commitment to human rights more broadly and to the modern human rights movement. As a result, I was declared a suspicious person by the junta, and eventually needed to leave the country.
That was the other time you were fired?
No, I wasn't fired, actually, that time. But I think it was an example of a foundation willing to take risks, and it produced a result. And I think it goes back to what Dennis was talking about in terms of the importance of values within the foundation. And at that point, the Ford Foundation was acknowledging its commitment to pluralism, to freedom of association, and to the integrity of the human person, because hundreds of people whose lives, in some cases, and whose careers were able to help save, had been in prison without charges, in many cases tortured. And that was a foundation, sort of, it seems to me, sort of going to the edge.
I'm struck by a couple things. I'm struck by, after starting GlobalGiving, I used to get a lot of entrepreneurs come to me and just fly their ideas by me, especially in the last few years. And I'm struck by how many of them I sent away just shaking my head, kind of like the CEO of that Angry Birds company. And how many of them now pop up on my radar screen telling me how successful they've been. And it's been really humbling because in the current environment I'm in, I can't control the ideas and control their perceived success. Just things succeed or they don't, regardless of what I think about them. And so that's been very humbling. Just kind of generically, I've learned to not pass judgment as much as I used to in my old job at the World Bank where I was supposed to pass judgment. One other thing that's really struck me, both positive and negative, is the importance of social capital and relationships in aid and development in general. And the tension between that and rules-based, sort of Weberian, rules-based bureaucracies, the things that we learned here at Woodrow Wilson and the World Bank held so dear. Everything's rules-based. You don't talk to people. There's no personal relationships. It's all rules-based, competitive bidding, et cetera. And in some ways, the philanthropy sector is much better to address things that are based on social capital and personal relationships. That's the upside and the promise. The downside is frequently those personal relationships and social capital have been focused inwardly. And all of us who have worked at or near a large foundation know how important the inward-facing social capital is with managers and the board. And that's a huge lost opportunity in my view. If that social capital could be pushed outward to the people it's supposed to serve, it would be tremendous.
One other question I came to this. After the Berlin Wall fell, some American foundations rushed in behind the Iron Curtain and began working on civil society, creation of new legal systems, etc., property rights. Is there an appropriate role for American philanthropy in Tunisia, through Egypt, through Yemen, now, or is it too early, and what are the risks of engagement at what juncture, and what is going on there now? Anyone?
Well, George Soros is certainly willing to try. I mean, and is actively exploring, and I think actually committed to I don't know if it's publicly committed, but to working in Egypt. And I think, again, he's an example of kind of philanthropic leader who is ready to take risks and
With his money.
with his money, and to fail or to succeed.
The other?
No.
But I think what makes it particularly difficult is that to find sort of the right combination in this case of the well, it must have Egyptian leadership, and yet leadership that is, it's not easy to find the quote right person.
Would you say he's a unique philanthropist with a tougher hide than most philanthropists when it comes to absorbing the flack that comes with that kind of engagement?
I think so. Yes, I do. And yet, as a personal history and a credibility, because of his success in business and his combination of thoughtfulness and willingness to sort of to stick with his commitments.
Any questions from the audience? Could you step up, please, to the microphone? Thank you.
Peter Saris, class of 59. Is there a conflict between philanthropy and ideology?
Is that a question posed to anyone?
I think this gets back again to the values question, because in much of this discussion too, by the way, the assumption has been in accord with the title of the whole colloquium that we're talking about, largely U.S. institutions, but obviously philanthropy is much broader. Mo Ibrahim was mentioned earlier in the day, for example, from Sudan. But I do think one of the things that has happened, not only with foundations, but also with the US-based international NGOs, is that there's been a consciousness a growing consciousness over recent decades that all of these organizations are importantly political. Now, some foundation people may still blanch at this, and some NGO people might have, but it's really changed substantially because whether it's an NGO or a foundation, these organizations are dealing importantly with distributive questions, with issues of empowerment and disempowerment. If they're not aware of power relationships, they're actually inadvertently likely to do harm. So they are called upon to articulate their values and their principles, and then to act on them. So in that sense, they are political. But virtually without exception, as foundations, they are nonpartisan as well. And, I'm sure there are ideological elements that enter into to people's views. They're part of their formation, but it's a combination. But most of these organizations, it's a combination of values and at the same time, a certain amount of pragmatism, because they actually want to make differences in the world, make the world better in some specific way, and it takes that combination.
Hugh noted that I had worked at the Better World campaign, before coming to the Gates Foundation. So I worked for two entirely different philanthropists, Ted Turner and Bill Gates. Now think of the temperaments of those two people, right? and what they brought to the table in terms of the philanthropy that they were working on. But I also, before that, worked on Capitol Hill. And one of the things that I came away from, because on the Hill you have to be a Democrat or a Republican, you have to declare. I actually, when I moved down to DC, my first set of interviews, people said, "Are you a Democrat or a Republican?" And I said, "I don't know, you know." But I had to pick a team, and then once you're on a team, it becomes kind of hard over on that side. And but what I walked away from Capitol Hill feeling was there wasn't one side or another that had a lock on rightness, on both of them, both Democrats and Republicans, both Ted Turner and Bill Gates. Anyone who's going into a philanthropic endeavor, I think they're genuinely hoping and expecting that they're doing things that are good for humanity. So you come at it from a different point of view, depending on your own personal ideology, and that absolutely permeates the institutions that they see. In this case, that Ted or Bill set up. But I think all of it is aiming towards doing the right thing for humans.
Hi, my name is Christina Graff. I'm an MPA alumna, and now I work here at the Woodrow Wilson School in Global Health Program. So to the panel, I wanted to ask a question that builds off of the comments about innovation and risk. What I'm wondering is how you can go about giving ample time for innovation to really work, given that the pressures of the funding and the reporting cycles can undermine the thoughtful and sound programming and the time that it takes to get things in place that are going to last.
Yeah, well, we've in the late 90s, I got called by when I was at the World Bank. The World Bank president called me up to his office and said, "Dennis, I'm making you head of innovation at the World Bank." And I remember just being terrified. I had finally gotten up pretty high in the bureaucracy because I learned how to work all those things you're talking about, the cycles, the projects, made one of the biggest projects and one of the biggest loans in World Bank history. And so I was really expert at all that stuff. And he was asking me to be head of innovation. And I remember I said, "Mr. Wolfenson, innovation?" And he said, "Yeah, you know, innovation, new products." And I said, "New products? What are new products?" And he said, "That's the whole problem. We haven't had any new products in the last 50 years. So give me some new products." And I spent like 9 months trying to bring about new products through the bureaucratic procedures that I had become very expert at. And I was really good at those. Unfortunately, there was a big clash between, as you say, the DNA of innovation and the DNA of the procedures that the organization uses. So what we did, and we did this out of desperation. In retrospect, it makes me look good, but the reality is we did it out of complete desperation. We just created a little unit, and we literally tore all the walls down in this unit. We had like 20 people, a ragtag bunch of C students. There were no Woodrow Wilson School people on this team. And we just decided to fly under the radar screen. And we just put together this little $5 million fund, which is nothing at the World Bank. And we said we were going to have this little event called the Development Marketplace. But it wasn't going to be a big deal. And it was only going to last a day or two. And nobody needed to pay attention to it because it's not a big deal. And then we decided that we would just invite anybody in the world with a good idea to come to the atrium of the bank on a certain day and pitch their idea. And by the time the bureaucracy caught up with what was going on, the train had left the station and the event was already getting ready to be staged. And the thing was a huge, huge, huge success at the bank at that time. And it was only possible because we just flew under the radar screen, kept it low profile. The president, to be fair to Wolfenson, he really protected us and kept the antibodies away. But in our case, now it's only one example, so I don't know how generalized it was. It had to be a leader who would provide space, and then a team that's willing to just do what it takes to do something radical, but not make too many claims in advance about it. Don't draw too much attention to yourself. Prove it by showing rather than talking.
And accountability expectations later, and giving them ample time to show results, is that part of the vision also?
Yes, and that's taken 10 years but finally it's happened. Gratified now that's happening. But it does take a long time.
Let me have, if you could wait just a second, follow. I'm curious what you think of the limitations of that method of operation. Could you get at polio that way, or is the only way to get at polio the way Gates is getting at it, if you're operating in the philanthropic sphere?
One of the, I'll give you two examples of things that came up in this marketplace. The first one that we did, some staff from the World Bank came up and they said we should be thinking about a vaccine guarantee fund for AIDS. And they said, we don't work on AIDS at the bank. This is 98 at this time. The pharmaceutical companies are trying to develop a vaccine for AIDS, but it's only going to be effective in North America and Europe, not in Africa and Asia, which is where our clients are. So these people came up with an idea that was not an existing product at the bank. The idea of a guarantee fund, and so they got a few $100,000, took that forward, and then Gates worked on it, and Goldman Sachs got behind it, and it eventually happened. That's at one kind of level. At another micro level, a lot of the problems on vaccines, et cetera, are about the distribution system, as they know. And so a lot of these social entrepreneurs come up with ideas of how can you get these little solar panels on refrigerators that will keep things refrigerated, all these little micro innovations that can be an adjunct to. They're not going to solve the problem with polio, but they may address something that Gates Foundation is not going to do, or World Bank or WHO.
And at the foundation, we've done, or Bill has done a lot of work to try to pull innovation in, systematically put it into the system. So there are a couple of different global health grand challenges efforts where to try to get at very difficult to attain health objectives. We just kind of throw open the door to people anywhere in the world. So you don't need a PhD and you don't need to be peer reviewed, and you just put it in. There's a small amount of money, and if you get some success with that, then you may get the next tranche of money. But basically, trying to lower the barriers to innovation globally in these areas. So I think there's some areas.
I just wanted to say on innovation, at the World Bank, for example, the health had long been thought of as a consumption item. Mm-hmm. And it's been touted over and over again today as being leading in the development field. Well, it was an innovation in the World Bank when health came into its own, right, and was regarded as part of development. Yeah. Something that simple, right, in retrospect, was really an important innovation.
This gentleman's been very patient.
Hank Gassner, class of 65. I mentioned in my earlier question the Green Revolution, and much of the credit for the Green Revolution has to go to Rockefeller Foundation for the funding of the research that into the miracle seeds, etc. But I am concerned by certain of the presentations whether in today's climate of trying to see measurable results quickly, whether people would be pulling the plants up by the roots to see at this stage, if it hasn't paid off within a year or two, then it's a failure. And whether there is today the patience to invest in research which may or may not pan out, with the faith that if you waited and you did it right, that you would create the seeds of a revolution.
Well, when I talked about sort of if things don't work out in the grant, then we may end up not continuing to fund it, is a bit of a misleading statement, because the Gates Foundation operates on a very long-term basis. That is to say, happily, we're not subject to the same kind of appropriations stuff that's going on in the U.S. government at this point, and because it is directed by a fairly small number of people, if we make commitments, we can make commitments to stay in for a long time. So, for example, when we're doing up a new program or an evaluation of what we're going to do next in maternal or child health or malaria or AIDS, the evaluation of how to get at the problem may take 2 or 3 years. That's just to get to the plan to put things in place. And then we go from there. So we're talking, it's actually a fairly long lead time and long-term investment that we make in the activities that we do fund. So I don't want to suggest that we're, pulling up the plants by the roots and that's awesome.
Just to follow up on the point, in the domestic side of philanthropy, there is a lot of chatter about venture philanthropy and short time horizons and measurable results and five-year time horizons. Has that spilled over into international philanthropy?
I thought a number of times today how important time horizons are and the scale of time that we're talking about, because very often I think they're completely unrealistic, and that you think about important social change, how many decades it often takes and how many ups and downs there are along the way, and how ill-prepared most institutions are. I do think that some of the better foundations, they have to balance innovation on the one hand with sort of steadfastness on the other. And actually the Gates example, in polio, it's really an example of Gates picking up on the commitment that others have made for a long time, and then finally coming to the sort of the end of their that steadfastness.
You've got the last question.
Hi, Sophia Peters. I'm an MPA graduating this year. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. But I have a question specifically as this field becomes more and more trendy and more popular, and as more and more sort of philanthropic organizations crop up and people start giving really large sums of money to foundations. How do we ensure that foundations are sort of, working together rather than competing over the same projects and sort of undoing each other's work, and how do we ensure that it doesn't become sort of competition over funding projects in the most important trendy areas, and rather growing together and working in concert with each other, which is something that I don't think is happening as much as it should.
Well, I think the good news is that so many philanthropists are so cantankerous and idiosyncratic. The Ted Turner versus Bill Gates thing. That's the good news. People have very different tastes, interests, etc. So that's going to mitigate a little against the flocking around one thing. I would caution a little bit about in international aid, in the official aid business, there's all this talk about partnerships, harmonization, and let's not have duplication. This is a terrible idea. Can you imagine what cell phones would be like today if all the phone companies had decided to harmonize and partner, and you guys do this and we'll do that? You wouldn't have this incredible innovation. So you do have to find a way to have a lot of competition for innovation, but then people who pick it up when it's actually successful. And it's one of the broken things in the aid business is you don't have a feedback loop so that people can harvest the gains from other people's innovations. I've been thinking a lot about that. I don't have an answer. Maybe in the next couple of years, if you can come up with an answer for that, you'll get the Nobel Prize for
I do think that whether we're talking about NGOs or whether we're talking about foundations, major foundations, there is more collaboration, more cooperation than historically there has been. And that I think it's partly that partnership has become a kind of almost like a buzzword, but it's also partly that there's a greater consciousness that it takes collaboration and cooperation to achieve the ambitious objectives that have been set.
Yeah. Just using the cell phone example, that made me think of it. So cell phone makers have agreed on certain technology standards, a certain backbone, but then they compete vigorously for the models. How can we do that more in philanthropy, where people agree on a certain standard and then they all try it in different ways? I don't know, but it's...
Well, I'd just like to comment on this point and then we'll close. I did serve for 6 years as Vice President of the Rockefeller Foundation. We spent a lot of time thinking about K-12 education in this context, and K-12 education is a bit of a zoo, to say the least. But it's interesting to think about this question of collaboration, because on the one hand, you want to leverage your resources. On the other hand, you have a great deal of pride that you've got something to bring to the table and you'd like to take some initiatives on your own. On the third hand, you don't want someone outside of the building programming your resources for you. And finally, oftentimes foundations would provide grants but require matches, and you'd be asked to support it, and you'd say, well, thank you very much, Foundation X, for putting pressure on me to support this worthy cause. And lastly, is there going to be reciprocity? If you want my money, are you going to give me your money? And at the end of the day, what does that accomplish? So I think there are clearly occasions when that kind of leverage works, and we saw in the community development sphere, for example, that a number of foundations have gotten together in various periods to amp up the U.S. investment in community-based economic development and housing development, and great examples of that. And other times there's a lot of pride of ownership, and a lot of it also depends on, I would say, foundations operate somewhere along the continuum from pretty reactive to what comes in over the transit to highly proactive. And when I was at Rockefeller, I mean, close to 90% of the money that we spent was in pursuit of strategies that we had developed inside the foundation, either on our own or in partnership with other organizations. And there really wasn't a lot of room for over-the-transit submissions. So how foundations think about leveraging and collaboration in part depends on what their method of operation is, and that isn't always transparent from what you may read about them. You have to know how they operate. Well, on that note, let me thank all of the panelists and thank you all for your